They opened her husband's secret journal and discovered the horrifying truth. He wasn't taken by sickness. He was being slowly, deliberately poisoned. A promise to a dying friend dragged a guilt-ridden giant back to the valley he'd abandoned. But the woman he loved was now a pregnant widow, hunted by the very man who murdered her husband, a ruthless enemy who wanted the deadly secret buried just beneath her feet. With an entire town turned against them, could one man's forgotten promise be enough to save her from the ashes of her life? The wind that swept down from the crazy mountains carried the biting promise of an early autumn, and with it, the ghost of yesterday's smoke. Eleanor Vance stood in the heart of what had been her home, a lone figure in a landscape of black bones and grey ash. The morning sun, usually a welcome visitor in Hope's End, now served only to illuminate the totality of her ruin. One hand rested protectively on the firm swell of her belly, a silent anchor in a world that had turned to dust. The floorboards were gone, the walls were skeletal timbers, and the quilt her grandmother had made was now a handful of scorched grey threads that dissolved at her touch. Everything was gone. Everything except the sawmill. It stood 50 yards away, a hulking silhouette against the vast Montana sky, spared by a lucky shift in the wind. The great circular saw blade, the heart of the mill, was silent. That silence was a wound deeper than the fire itself. It was the sound of Michael's absence. The mill had been his dream, each beam an iron bolt a testament to a future he'd planned for them, for the child he would now never hold. Bartholomew Thorne, with his fine suits and coyote's smile, had called the fire a tragic accident. But Ellie knew it for what it was, a final warning written in flame and ash, an offer she was meant to be too broken to refuse. She was broken, but she was not beaten. She felt the faint, insistent kick of the life inside her, a tiny rebellion against the desolation. It was a reminder that Michael's legacy wasn't just wood and steel, it was blood and bone. Straightening her back, though every muscle ached with a weariness that went far beyond the physical, she looked past the valley, toward the distant trails that led out into the wider, uncaring world. There was no one left to turn to. The law in Hope's End wore a tin star and took Thorne's money. Her neighbors were good people, but they were frightened people, with their own families to protect. Hope, she thought with a bitter irony, was a cruel name for a place that had taken everything from her. As the cold wind pulled at her worn dress, a single name escaped her lips, a sound torn from a place of memory and last resorts. It wasn't a shout, not even a call, but a whisper breathed into the uncaring air like a final desperate prayer. Cole. Hundreds of miles south, where the Montana pines gave way to the cracked, sun-baked earth of the territory, Cole Shannon drove a fence post into the ground with a single, powerful swing of his maul. He was a man built on the scale of the mountains he'd left behind, with shoulders that could block the sun and hands that seemed better suited for uprooting trees than mending fences. But for 10 years, he had chosen the small, repetitive tasks of a hired hand, seeking a penance that never came. His size made other men wary, but it was the deep, settled sorrow in his eyes that made them keep their distance. It was the look of a man haunted by a ghost of his own making. The letter arrived with a traveling supply wagon, a crumpled, sweat-stained envelope that had been on the trail for weeks. The postmark was from a town near Hope's End. Cole's hands, which could snap a man's wrist without effort, trembled slightly as he opened it. It was from an old friend of his and Michael's, the words written in a hurried, desperate scrawl. "Michael is gone. A sickness in the lungs," they said. "Thorne is pressing her." The house burned. "She's alone, Cole, and she's carrying Michael's child." Each word was a hammer blow, shattering the careful solitude he had built around himself. Thorne. The name was a foul taste in his mouth. He sank onto a nearby stump, the letter crushed in his fist. He saw Michael's face, not as the strong, capable man he was, but as he had been in their last bitter argument. Cole had called him a fool for standing up to a man like Thorne over a piece of timber and a line on a map. Michael had called him a coward for wanting to run. In the end, they were both right. Michael had stayed and died a fool's death. Cole had run and lived a coward's life, and Ellie was caught in the middle, just as she had always been. He remembered the promise, made one night under a blanket of stars, whiskey on their breath and the foolish bravado of youth in their hearts. "If anything ever happens to me, Cole, you watch over her." It had seemed an easy promise to make then, an impossible one to keep after he'd ridden away. There was no decision to be made. There was only a debt to be paid. He stood, the grief and guilt of a decade hardening into cold purpose. He collected his meager pay, saddled his big roan mare, the only thing in this world that didn't seem small to him, and packed nothing but a bedroll, his Colt, and a Winchester rifle. Within the hour, he was riding north, a solitary giant moving against the setting sun, leaving the dust of his exile behind to face the ashes of his past. He found her exactly where he'd pictured her, a solitary figure standing guard over the silent sawmill. When he rode into the clearing, the sound of his horse's hooves on the hard-packed earth was unnaturally loud. He dismounted, the leather of his saddle groaning in protest. 10 years and 1,000 miles vanished in the space between them, leaving only the raw, unfinished history that lay like a fallen log in their path. Her eyes, once bright with laughter, were now clouded with a grief so profound it seemed to steal the very color from the sky. One hand was splayed across her stomach, a gesture that was both a shield and a declaration. "Ellie," he said. The name felt foreign on his tongue, a word he had no right to speak. "You came," she replied, her voice flat, devoid of welcome or surprise. It was a simple statement of fact, layered with a decade of unspoken questions. He saw the accusation in the stiff set of her shoulders, but beneath it, so faint he thought he might have imagined it, was a flicker of something else. Not hope, exactly, but the memory of what it felt like. The letter. "It found me late," he managed, the words sounding hollow and useless. He felt 100 feet tall and an inch wide, his own guilt a weight that threatened to crush him. He wanted to explain, to apologize, to somehow undo the past, but his throat was a knot of useless words. Their tense silence was broken by the arrival of 2 more riders. They were Thorne's men, their casual arrogance worn like a uniform. They reined in their horses, taking in the scene with smug superiority. "Ma'am," the taller one said, touching the brim of his hat with a mocking politeness, "Mr. Thorne sends his deepest sympathies about your misfortune. Hopes you'll reconsider his generous offer now that you're in a delicate condition." Before Ellie could answer, Cole moved. It was not a sudden or aggressive act, but a slow, deliberate shifting of his weight, as if a mountain were settling into a new position. He placed himself directly in front of her, his back to her, facing the 2 men. He said nothing. He didn't have to. The sheer bulk of him was a statement, his shadow falling over the riders like a coming storm. The men's smirks faltered. They looked at his face, saw the cold, flat promise of violence in his eyes, and understood they were not dealing with a grieving widow anymore. After a tense moment, they exchanged a nervous glance, muttered a curse, and wheeled their horses around, kicking up dust as they retreated. Cole did not move until the sound of their hoofbeats faded completely. When he finally turned back to Ellie, the chasm between them was still there, vast and silent. He had protected her from Thorne's dogs, but he could not protect her from the ghost of the man who stood between them. The town of Hope's End consisted of a single dusty street, a collection of tired wooden buildings baking under the Montana sun. Cole's presence turned heads. Men stopped their conversations to watch him pass, their faces guarded. He ignored them, tying his horse in front of the sheriff's office. The man behind the desk, Sheriff Brody, was as worn and faded as the wanted posters on his wall. He had a drooping mustache and the weary eyes of someone who'd seen too much and done too little. "Fire was a tragedy," Brody said, after Cole had laid out the facts in a low, even tone. The sheriff leaned back in his squeaking chair, refusing to meet Cole's hard gaze. "But this is a rough country. Accidents happen. This was no accident, and those men you saw me with yesterday work for Thorne," Cole stated, his voice like gravel. Brody sighed, a long, rattling sound of defeat. "Son, some rocks are best left unturned in this valley. A smart man knows when to pack up and find new pasture, especially when he's got a woman and a coming child to think about." It wasn't advice, it was a warning. The law had no intention of helping them. Cole turned and walked out, the feeling of being utterly alone colder than any mountain wind. Later that afternoon, a polished black buggy, drawn by a pair of perfectly matched gray horses, rolled to a stop near the sawmill. Bartholomew Thorne stepped down. He was dressed in a fine wool coat despite the heat, a man who bent the seasons to his will, not the other way around. He carried a wicker basket filled with fruits and cheese, an offering that was both an insult and a threat. He approached Ellie, his smile as smooth and cold as a river stone. "Mrs. Vance," he began, his voice cultured and calm, "my deepest condolences on your recent losses. I came to see if you were in need of anything. A woman in your delicate state should not be burdened with the anxieties of running such an enterprise." "I'm managing, Mr. Thorne," Ellie said, her voice steady. She stood on the porch of the small cabin they'd been using for storage, her hands clasped before her. Of course. A woman of great fortitude, just as Michael always said. Thorne's eyes swept over the sawmill, a glint of possessive hunger in their depths. "Which is why I am prepared to offer you a sum that will ensure you and your child are comfortable for the rest of your days. Think of it not as a sale, but as a release from this hardship." Ellie looked directly into his eyes, and for a moment she saw past the refined gentleman to the predator beneath. She saw the man who had watched her husband sicken and die, who had signed her home's death warrant with a casual flick of his wrist. "My husband built this mill with his own hands, on land his father worked before him," she said, her voice quiet but unyielding. "It is not for sale. Not now. Not ever." For a single unguarded second, the mask of civility slipped. A flicker of cold reptilian fury tightened Thorne's features. Then, just as quickly it was gone, replaced by the serene smile. He gave a slight, formal bow. "A pity," he said softly. "A great pity." He turned, climbed back into his buggy, and drove away, leaving behind a silence more menacing than any shouted threat. The handshake had been offered and refused. Now the fist would fall. The days that followed settled into a grim routine. Cole worked from dawn until dusk, his hammer blows echoing through the valley as he repaired the cabin and reinforced the sawmill's defenses. Ellie, meanwhile, fought a quieter war, trying to salvage a life from the wreckage. She was sorting through a crate of items they'd stored in the mill's small office when she found it. A worn, leather-bound copy of Leaves of Grass, Michael's favorite. Her fingers traced the faded gold lettering, the simple act bringing a fresh wave of grief so sharp it stole her breath. He used to read to her from this book, his voice a low rumble against the sound of the wind in the pines. She opened the cover, half expecting to find a pressed flower or a forgotten note, but her thumb brushed against something hard and flat, taped to the inside. Carefully, she peeled back the thick paper and revealed a small, ornate brass key, tarnished with age. Beneath it, folded into a tiny square, was a scrap of paper. Michael's familiar, steady handwriting filled the space. It wasn't a letter, just a single, cryptic sentence. "The truth is where it began." Her heart hammered against her ribs. It was a message from the grave, a final whisper from the man she loved. She walked out to the porch where Cole was splitting firewood, the axe rising and falling with an almost hypnotic rhythm. She held out her hand, palm up, showing him the key and the note. He stopped, leaning the axe against the woodpile, and wiped his hands on his trousers before taking the small objects from her. The key looked impossibly tiny in his massive, calloused hand. He stared at it, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Where it began," Ellie said, her voice barely a whisper. "What did he mean, Cole?" He was silent for a long moment, turning the key over and over. Then, a light of recognition, the first genuine spark she'd seen in him since his return, flickered in his weary eyes. "The old sovereign oak," he said, his voice low, with a sudden, dawning wonder. "Down by Miller's Creek. When we were boys, before we built anything, before we were anything, we buried a box." He looked from the key to her face, and for the first time, the space between them didn't feel like a chasm of grief, but a bridge of shared purpose. Michael hadn't just left them a legacy to defend, he had left them a map to follow. That night, sleep offered no peace. Cole lay awake in the small barn he'd claimed as his own, listening to the sounds of the valley settling. It was a faint, unnatural clang from the direction of the sawmill that brought him to his feet. It was the sound of metal on metal, sharp and wrong in the dead of night. He moved without a sound, grabbing not his gun, but a heavy iron pry bar that leaned against the door. He trusted its silent, solid weight in his hands. Shadows detached themselves from the deeper darkness around the mill, and he saw them slip through a side door. He followed, a massive ghost melting into the cavernous space, the familiar scent of pine and machine oil filling his lungs. Moonlight slanted through the high windows, illuminating the scene. 3 men, and they weren't trying to set a fire. They were gathered around the massive main saw, the heart of the mill. One of them, a man with a lean, wolfish build Cole recognized as the leader from the other day, was using a sledgehammer to systematically shatter the cast-iron housing of the blade's drive mechanism. A cold, pure rage, colder than any fear, settled over Cole. This was not just destruction, it was desecration. He didn't shout a warning. He let the pry bar swing. The first man went down with a sickening thud before he even knew Cole was there. The other 2 spun around, and the mill exploded into a chaos of grunts, curses, and the brutal sound of fists meeting flesh. Cole fought like a cornered grizzly, using his size and his knowledge of the space, knocking one man into a stack of lumber and using a heavy logging chain to sweep the legs out from another. He was a force of nature, a whirlwind of protective fury. He finally cornered the leader, Silas, pinning him against the very saw he had been trying to destroy. In the pale moonlight, their faces were inches apart. Cole's knuckles were bleeding, his breath coming in ragged bursts. He raised the pry bar to deliver a final crippling blow. But Silas didn't flinch. He didn't beg. He simply looked at Cole, and in his cold, calculating eyes, Cole saw something that stopped him dead. It was not fear. It was a flicker of what looked like grudging respect, a silent acknowledgement from one dangerous man to another. Then, with a sudden, snake-like speed, Silas kicked out, not at Cole, but at a nearby lever. A heavy loading hook swung down from the rafters, forcing Cole to stumble back. In that single moment of separation, Silas gave a sharp whistle. His men scrambled to their feet and vanished into the darkness. Cole was left standing alone in the wounded silence of the mill, the pry bar still gripped in his hand. The saw was broken, but the brief, strange understanding that had passed between him and his enemy left him with a far more unsettling chill. The morning air was sharp and cold as they made their way to Miller's Creek. The damage to the mill sat between them, a grim, unspoken reality, but the weight of the brass key in Cole's pocket was a small, insistent counterpoint of hope. The sovereign oak was even larger than he remembered, a silent, ancient king whose roots ran as deep as their own history in this valley. They found the spot without a word, a patch of earth that was still slightly sunken after all these years. Cole dug with a shovel from the barn, the soft earth yielding easily. Soon, the shovel struck something solid, a small tin box, rusted but intact. For a moment, kneeling there, they were children again. Cole could almost hear Michael's laughter, see the mischievous glint in his eyes as they buried their treasures. A lucky arrowhead, a bird's skull, a foreign coin. But when Cole pried open the lid, there were no childhood trinkets inside. There was only a single leather-bound journal, its pages filled with Michael's steady, familiar script. Back in the cabin, with the door bolted and the rifle leaning against the wall, Ellie began to read aloud. Her voice was a soft, steady murmur as she recounted Michael's early entries. His joy at finishing the flume, his pride in the first timber contract, his boundless love and anticipation for the coming child. It was like hearing his voice again, a sweet, painful echo in the quiet room. Then the tone began to shift. October 12th. Thorne made another offer today. Higher. There's a desperation in him I don't understand. It's just timberland. Why this patch of earth so badly? Pa always said this valley had secrets. Tomorrow I'll do some surveying myself, the way he taught me. Ellie paused, her breath catching. She flipped a few pages, her eyes scanning quickly. Her next words were barely a whisper. November the 3rd. It's not the timber. It was never the timber. The quartz load-bearing strata here. It's exactly like the formations Pa described. I found traces. Not just traces. A vein. God forgive me. Cole was right to be worried. This land doesn't hold a living. It holds a fortune. The final entry was dated only a week before his death. The handwriting was shaky. The ink bled in places as if from a trembling hand. Ellie's voice broke as she read it. The sickness grows worse each day. It began after I shared a drink with Thorne to discuss his final offer. He knows I know. My hands shake so badly I can barely write this. He is poisoning me, slowly, so no one will suspect. Ellie, my love, if you are reading this, it means I have failed you. There is only one man I trust to finish this. Find Cole. Tell him to avenge me. The journal slipped from Ellie's nerveless fingers, falling to the floor with a soft thud. A single, horrified sob escaped her lips, the sound of a heart breaking for the second time. Cole didn't move to comfort her. He couldn't. He bent down, picked up the journal, and read the last words for himself. The grief that had haunted him for a decade burned away, replaced by something cold, hard, and absolute. This was no longer about a promise. It was about a reckoning. The knowledge in the journal was a fire in their veins. They now had the truth, a weapon more potent than any rifle. But Bartholomew Thorne was a master strategist, and he understood that the truth is only as powerful as the people who are willing to hear it. He must have sensed the shift, the new resolve in them, because he moved before they could. He didn't send men with guns or torches. He sent whispers. When Cole rode into town for supplies, flour, salt, cartridges, he felt the change immediately. It was in the way old Mr. Henderson, the proprietor of the general store, suddenly found the floorboards fascinatingly dusty. It was in the way his friendly greeting died in his throat when he saw Cole's list. "Sorry, Cole," Henderson mumbled, not meeting his eyes. I'm fresh out of just about everything you need. Wagon's late." It was a lie, and they both knew it. Behind the counter, Cole could see a fresh sack of flour, the very brand he'd asked for. He saw the fear in the old man's eyes, and he understood. Thorne's reach extended to every ledger and line of credit in Hope's End. He walked out, the list still in his hand. The chill followed him down the street. Men who had known him his whole life, men he'd shared drinks with, now tipped their hats to the opposite side of the street, their faces blank masks. He saw Mrs. Gable, who had bandaged his knee when he was 10, hurry her young son indoors as he approached. The whispers had done their work. He was no longer Cole Shannon, son of the valley. He was a dangerous outsider, a vulture who had come back to prey on his best friend's widow. He returned to the sawmill empty-handed. He didn't have to explain. Ellie saw the hard set of his jaw, the bleakness in his eyes. She had felt it too. The Crawford family, their closest neighbors, had been due to bring by a pail of fresh milk that morning. They never came. She had watched their wagon pass on the main road an hour later, heading to town without so much as a glance in her direction. "He's turned them," she said, her voice heavy. "All of them." Cole stood beside her on the cabin porch, looking out at the vast, beautiful, and suddenly hostile valley. It was the same land, the same mountains, the same sky, but it was no longer their home. Thorn had methodically and cruelly severed every tie that bound them to this place, cutting them adrift. They were utterly alone now, two people on a small island, with an entire ocean of fear, suspicion, and Thorn's suffocating power surrounding them. The trap snapped shut the next morning. It came in the form of Sheriff Brody, who rode into their clearing not as a man, but as an instrument of the law. He wasn't alone this time. A young, nervous-looking deputy sat on his horse a few paces behind, his hand hovering near the butt of his pistol, a clear sign that this was not a social call. Cole and Ellie met them on the porch, standing side by side, a united front against the coming storm. Brody didn't dismount. He looked down at them from his saddle, and for the first time, Cole saw a flicker of shame in the old lawman's eyes before it was extinguished by a weary resignation. "Ellie Cole," he said, his voice flat and official. "There have been complaints. Folks are on edge. For the good of the community and for your own safety, I'm giving you 24 hours to pack your things and leave the valley." "On what grounds, Sheriff?" Ellie demanded, her voice ringing with a strength that belied her condition. "On the grounds that our home was burned down and my husband was murdered." Brody winced. "This is not a debate, Ellie. It's a final warning." "We're not leaving," Cole said, his voice a low rumble. He took a half-step forward, and the young deputy flinched, his hand tightening on his gun. The sheriff sighed, a sound of bone-deep exhaustion, and reached into his coat pocket. He produced a folded piece of paper. "I was hoping you wouldn't say that," he said, holding up the document. "Silas and 2 other men from Thorn's outfit have filed a formal complaint. Says you attacked them without provocation in the mill 2 nights ago. I have a warrant for your arrest, Cole, for assault." The accusation was so brazen, so utterly false, that it was almost laughable. But the warrant in the sheriff's hand was deadly serious. It was the final move in Thorn's game, a checkmate that left them with no legal recourse. Cole could either surrender, leaving Ellie to Thorn's mercy, or he could resist and become a fugitive, a man who could be shot on sight with the full backing of the law. "You know this is a lie, Brody," Cole said, his voice dangerously quiet. "What I know doesn't matter anymore," the sheriff replied, his gaze finally meeting Cole's. There was a silent, desperate plea in his eyes. "Don't make me do this." He tossed the warrant onto the ground between them. 24 hours, he repeated, his voice strained. "By noon tomorrow, you either be gone, or I'm coming back with a posse, and we won't be talking." He turned his horse and rode away, the deputy scrambling to follow, leaving the trumped-up charge lying in the dust like a death sentence. The warrant lay on the rough-hewn table, an ugly stain on the landscape of their lives. The ultimatum hung in the air between them, heavy and suffocating. Ellie sank into a chair, her hands trembling as she pressed them against her stomach. For the first time, Cole saw her unwavering strength begin to fray, her resilience worn thin by the relentless tide of Thorn's malice. The sight of her vulnerability finally broke the dam of his own long-held silence. "He called me a coward," Cole said, his voice a raw, splintered thing. He didn't look at her, staring instead at the whorls in the wooden table as if they held the map of his own mistakes. "The night before I left, we argued, right here in this valley. I told him he was a fool for provoking Thorn, that he was going to get himself killed over pride and principle. He looked me in the eye and said I was a coward for wanting to run." Cole's massive shoulders slumped. He was right. I was a coward. I ran, and the last words I ever said to my best friend were a curse. He finally looked up, his eyes swimming with a decade of unshed grief and shame. He expected to see anger in her face or disgust. He expected her to finally unleash the blame he knew he deserved. Instead, she listened, her expression softening. When he finished, she rose slowly and walked to the small wooden chest where she kept the journal. She opened it, her fingers finding a page marked with a pressed Indian paintbrush flower. She brought the book back to the table and laid it open before him. "He wrote this the week after you left," she said, her voice gentle. "Read it." Cole's eyes fell to the page, to Michael's familiar, flowing script. "Cole left today. The cabin feels emptier, the valley quieter." His words were hard, but they came from a place of fear for me, and I was too proud to see it. Fear and friendship can look a lot like anger in men like us. I hope one day he understands that I never held it against him. I forgive him. My only prayer is that if this valley does indeed swallow me whole, that same good, frightened heart of his will be brave enough to guide him home. He read the words once, then twice. The air left his lungs in a ragged, shuddering gasp. It was not a pardon he had been given. It was a gift. It was understanding. It was absolution. The immense, crushing weight of his guilt, a burden he had carried every single day for 10 years, simply dissolved. He looked up at Ellie, the tears he'd held back for so long, finally tracing paths through the dust on his cheeks. The ghost that had haunted him was gone. He was no longer a man paying a debt of shame. He was a brother answering a call. He was free to fight, not for redemption, but for them. The morning sun brought no warmth, only the sharp, cold reality of their deadline, noon. The sheriff's posse would come, and their world would end. But the absolution from Michael's journal had burned away their despair, leaving behind a hard, defiant purpose. They would not wait for the end to come to them. They would meet it halfway, on their own terms. It was Ellie who remembered it, her eyes suddenly bright with a wild, desperate light. "The dam," she said, her voice taut with excitement. Cole looked up from cleaning his rifle. "The little logging dam Michael built up on the North Fork." She began pacing, her energy a stark contrast to the weariness of the day before. He was clearing some old mining claims for the lumber. There was dynamite, old and unstable. He packed it in the base of the dam to reinforce a weak spot. He always joked that if Thorne ever sent an army, we could light a fuse and wash them all the way to Dakota. It was a madman's joke, the kind of tall tale a man tells by the fire. But in their desperation, it sounded like a battle plan. Cole saw it instantly. The dam was situated at the mouth of the narrow canyon road, the only fast route into this part of the valley. If they could blow it, the resulting flash flood would turn the road into an impassable bog of mud and timber. It wouldn't stop the posse forever, but it would buy them time. Time was everything. They had already sent for the one man they knew they could trust, old Jebediah, the trapper who had sent Cole the letter. He had arrived before dawn, his face a road map of worry. He took the journal, tucked it deep inside his coat, and set off on a treacherous, little-known mountain trail that led west, a 3-day ride to the territorial capital and the U.S. Marshals. Their only hope was to give him a head start. They worked with a frantic, silent efficiency. They found the rest of the dynamite, sweating and unstable, in a locked shed behind the mill. At the dam, a rough-hewn structure of logs and earth, they found the access point Michael had built, a small channel leading to the packed explosives. As Cole carefully placed the new charges, Ellie worked beside him, her hands steady as she helped prepare the fuses. They were no longer a grieving widow and a haunted giant. They were partners, soldiers in a war of two, their movements synchronized by a shared, unspoken understanding. The valley held its breath around them, the minutes ticking away toward the inevitable noon deadline. They had the fuse laid, a long, thin serpent of black powder snaking away from the heart of the dam. Cole knelt, striking a match against a dry rock he'd kept sheltered under his coat. He had one chance, but as he lowered the flickering flame, the world seemed to hold its breath, and then exhale in a violent rush. The sky, which had been a clear, cold blue moments before, turned a bruised purple. A sudden, ferocious wind tore through the canyon, ripping at their clothes and extinguishing the match as if it were a child's birthday candle. Thunder, not as a distant rumble but as a deafening crack directly overhead, split the sky. At the exact same moment, Ellie cried out, a sharp, involuntary gasp of pain. She doubled over, one hand braced against the rough bark of a pine, the other clutching her belly. "Ellie?" Cole was at her side in an instant. It's nothing," she gasped, her face pale and beaded with a mixture of rain and sweat. "Just a cramp." But it wasn't just a cramp. Another wave of pain seized her, harder this time, and she couldn't suppress a low moan. The storm broke then, not with a gentle shower, but a torrential downpour, turning the dry earth to slick, running mud. The wind howled like a banshee, and through the chaos, Cole saw the terrible, undeniable truth in her eyes. The baby was coming, not in a few weeks. Now. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced the armor of his resolve. He looked at Ellie, her face a mask of pain, as another contraction gripped her. He looked at the useless fuse, now soaked and half buried in mud. He looked down the canyon road, where he could almost hear the approaching hoofbeats of the posse, their noon deadline arriving with the storm. Everything was converging at once, a perfect, catastrophic trinity of danger. He was trapped. To stay and help Ellie meant being caught defenseless by Brody and his men. To attempt to light the fuse now, in this deluge, was a fool's errand that would leave her exposed and vulnerable. His mind, which had been so clear, so focused on the mission, was now a whirlwind of impossible choices. Justice for Michael, the lives of Ellie and her child, his promise to the dead versus his duty to the living. "Cole," Ellie managed to say, her voice strained through gritted teeth. "The posse. You have to—" He barely heard her. All he could see was her face, etched with pain, and all he could feel was the terrifying weight of her life and the life of her child, resting squarely in his hands. In that single chaotic moment, 10 years of guilt and a single sacred promise clarified into one absolute truth. To hell with the dam, to hell with the posse, to hell with justice if it cost him this. Cole scooped Ellie into his arms as if she weighed nothing, her gasp of pain a spur to his heart. He half carried, half dragged her through the lashing rain, his eyes scanning the rock face for any kind of shelter. He found it. A shallow cave carved out of the canyon wall, barely more than an overhang, but it was dry. He gently lowered her onto a bed of pine needles, just as another contraction racked her body. The world narrowed to the space of that small cave. The storm raged outside, a distant, roaring beast, but inside there was only Ellie's ragged breathing and Cole's low, steady voice, murmuring words of encouragement he didn't know he possessed. And then, impossibly, through the sheets of rain, a sound sharper than the thunder, the click of a rifle hammer being cocked. Shadows darkened the mouth of the cave. Bartholomew Thorne stood there, rain dripping from the brim of his hat, a satisfied, predatory smile on his face. Behind him stood Silas and 2 other men, their guns leveled. They had found them. "Well," Thorne said, his voice dripping with mock sympathy, "it seems Mother Nature has saved me the trouble of flushing you out. A touching domestic scene." He looked from Ellie's pained face to Cole's defiant one. "A pity it must end. Silas," he commanded, his voice turning to ice. "No witnesses. Tidy work." Silas stepped forward, his pistol raising, its black eyes staring into the heart of the cave. Cole moved to shield Ellie with his own body, a futile, final act of defiance. But Silas's eyes weren't on Cole. They were on Ellie, on the raw, primal agony and power of a woman bringing life into the world, and in that moment he didn't see a target. He saw a ghost, the face of his own wife, lost to a fever years ago while giving birth to a child who had survived only a single, heartbreaking day. Thorne's casual order to execute a woman and her newborn child was a line Silas did not know he had until he was ordered to cross it. "No," Silas said, his voice quiet but absolute. He didn't lower his gun. He simply turned his wrist, the barrel now aimed squarely at Thorne's chest. "Not this." Thorne's face contorted in disbelief and fury. "You dare!" But his words were drowned out by the thunderous arrival of more horses. Sheriff Brody and his posse skidded to a halt, their eyes widening at the impossible standoff. The instant of confusion was all it took. Thorne drew his own sidearm, but Silas fired first. The cave erupted in a deafening cacophony of gunfire. Cole threw himself over Ellie as bullets splintered the rock around them. When the chaos subsided seconds later, Thorne lay dead in the mud, and his remaining men had surrendered to Brody's posse. And from the heart of the cave, beneath the sudden, miraculous parting of the storm clouds, came a new sound. Not a gunshot, not a curse, but the strong, angry, beautiful cry of a newborn baby. The following spring, the Valley of Hope's End was reborn. The snows melted, feeding a vibrant green that seemed to wash away the memory of ash and blood. Bartholomew Thorne was a name whispered with a shudder, his corrupt empire dismantled by the U.S. Marshals Jebediah had brought back with him. The gold, it turned out, belonged to the valley itself, and its wealth was now being used to found a school, a proper doctor's office, and to give the families Thorne had bled dry a new start. Silas, whose testimony had been crucial, had served a short sentence and then ridden west, a man seeking a quiet place to outrun his own ghosts. The sound of a hammer striking nails echoed in the clear mountain air. Cole was on the roof of a new, sturdily built cabin that stood where the old one had burned, its fresh pine timbers smelling of resilience and new beginnings. He moved with a purpose he hadn't felt in his life. The movements of a man who was no longer running from a past, but building a future. The child's cry from below was not one of distress, but of simple, demanding life. He looked down to see Ellie standing on the new porch, their son cradled in her arms. She smiled up at him, a real, easy smile that reached her eyes. He climbed down the ladder, his heart settling into a comfortable rhythm he was finally getting used to. The boy was small but strong, with a shock of dark hair and his mother's determined eyes. "There's one last thing," Ellie said, her voice soft. She held out the journal, which she had kept safe, open to the very last page. "One more entry. Michael wrote it the night he realized he was being poisoned. I think it was meant for you to read when it was all over." Cole took the book. Michael's handwriting was weak, but his words were iron. "The pain is great now. I do not have much time. I leave this world with only 2 regrets, that I will not see my child grow, and that I did not have the chance to tell my brother Cole that he was right to be afraid for me. If you are reading this, my friend, it means you came home. That is all I ever truly asked." Cole had to stop, his vision blurring. He swallowed hard and continued reading. "Protect them, Cole. That is the promise you made. But know this. If the child is a boy, I ask that you name him for yourself. And understand that the greatest promise is not just to stand guard over my family, but to become a part of it. Your heart is his home now. Build something that will last." He closed the journal, his hand trembling. He looked at Ellie, his heart too full for words, and then down at the small, sleeping baby in her arms. Thomas Cole Vance. He reached out one huge, calloused finger, and the baby's tiny hand instinctively curled around it, a grip of surprising strength. For the first time in 10 long years, a true, unburdened smile spread across Cole Shannon's face. It was a smile, free of ghosts, free of guilt, full of a quiet, profound peace. Here, in the ruins of the past, surrounded by the promise of a future, hope had not ended. It had just begun. In a place called Hope's End, they found their new beginning, a promise kept and a future earned. If you believe a single promise can change the world, please leave a simple one in the comments below to let us know this story reached your heart. And if you want to feel this way again, make sure you subscribe to our channel. The trail doesn't end here, and we have another story from the heart of the West waiting for you just around the bend.